let's begin. I haven't got a pocket today, so I have to hold this and that. So who knows where we're going to end up. So today we're talking about the Baroque, following on from the Renaissance last week. And the Baroque movement is very, very different to the Renaissance itself. And it really develops over a period of time in the late 16th century as a result of, first of all, the massive changes in Europe at the time, particularly with the development of Protestantism and then the sack of Rome in 1527, when the city is more or less decimated, and then rebuilt gradually over the next 150 years. And if the Renaissance, I'll just bring that first image up, if you look at the Crucifixion by Giotto on the left-hand side, admittedly a very early Renaissance work, you can see that it is based on a particular kind of order. You have a very strong vertical in each of the figures. You have a strong horizontal. And so it's ordered on a particular kind of linear pattern. Jump forward to 1612, and this work, which is actually a Spanish painting, a Baroque painting, and you can see that, although it is also a crucifixion, you now have very strong diagonals. You have a strong diagonal here, and particularly there. And so no longer are the figures arranged across the canvas of the surface of the canvas. Then there's also there are certain similarities, of course. You've got this group here in conversation, and you have this group here in not so much in conversation as in expressing emotion. The figure of the Magdalene supporting Mary in her moment of extreme grief. So those two sort of aspects point up the great differences between the Renaissance and the Baroque, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. If we go to painting in particular, on the left from our own collection and two works from the Corsini exhibition, you can also see how it affects the depiction of the human figure and the depiction of emotion. If you look at Saint Sebastian, and you can see this if you go up to the Mackelvie Gallery after the talk, you can see that the body has a strong angle here, a diagonal with the raised knee, the shoulder one higher than the other, the face looking off over his shoulder and upwards. And Farini, of course, was famous for depicting the figure looking upwards in a state of spiritual ecstasy. And this represents a development in the Baroque period that was strongly emphasised within the Catholic Church, where it was, instead of using the priest as a conduit, there was a greater emphasis on the individual having a religious experience either through prayer or through looking at art or listening to perhaps even music that allows you to become at one with the figure that you are studying. And the role of saints became more important. So everyone had their own particular saint that they were given at baptism, and if you were called Sebastian, obviously Saint Sebastian was your saint, and you were encouraged to build up a relationship with that figure. And so often, just as in the Renaissance you would have talked to a painting of the Virgin Mary, if you needed spiritual advice and sustenance, you would do that with your particular saint. And that kind of dynamism is also seen in Saint Sebastian, in that he's sent off to one side. So you get a glimpse of a landscape behind. But in fact it is the play of light on the human body and the human body's movement expressing what Sebastian is feeling that helps you to engage with the image. Now, of course, some images of Saint Sebastian, particularly early Renaissance images, he looks a bit like a porcupine because he's been shot with so many arrows. Here he simply has one going into just below his rib cage, but the emphasis is actually on his flesh. This is a body that you feel you could reach out and touch, and the skin would be soft. And so he's actually taken the torso from a sketch from a classical torso in Rome, but he's taken marble and he's transformed it into living flesh. And of course, because of his own divine ecstasy, he doesn't feel the pain when he's pierced by the arrow. And Saint Sebastian was also the patron saint that was thought to protect you against the plague, along with San Rocco. So he had a dual purpose. Now, if you look at the little work by Carlo Dolci, that also is influence. It's painted later. Ours, we think, is about 1625. We're not quite sure. But the Carlo Dolci, although painted later, draws very much on the precedent set by Guido Reni. You have the figure of hope, who could be a religious figure, but she could also be the allegorical figure of hope. Her hands clasped in prayer, or perhaps beseeching, looking up to heaven, very much in imitation of Saint Sebastian. And as with a lot of the paintings from the time, a dark background used to throw the figure, and particularly the light areas of the figure, here the white cuffs but rolled back, but also the softness and lightness of the flesh as a contrast, and the rest of the figure very much in dark costume. When you look at Guercino, painted in between, and his portrait, so-called, of San Andrea Corsini, who, of course, as we know, was a real person in the 14th century. Instead, Guercino has the saint gazing down at a crucifix. He's looking at the death of Christ, and if you get close to the image upstairs, you'll see a single tear rolling down his cheek. One of the things that the Baroque artists tried to do was capture or suggest a moment in time, the most important moment in any narrative. And so, of course, with Sebastian, it's that overcoming the pain by his own spiritual devotion. And the same in a sense with San Andrea. But also, what San Andrea reflects is that contemplation of humanity's inhumanity. Man's inhumanity to man. That human beings could do such a terrible thing as crucify a person for their faith. And of course, that kind of image continues to have potency today because we still behave in the same kind of way. Now, that kind of drama plays through in some small works in the exhibition which are based on biblical narratives, and there are numerous artists who produced very dramatic works throughout the Baroque period. And Caravaggio, Artemisia, Gentileschi, there are numerous artists. But the little works in the show are particularly potent, in a way, because of their scale. Both Rosselli's Già l'Incisara and Triumph of David are tiny works of the same scale, painted on copper. And they're in climate-controlled cases in the exhibition, because these are normally hung in Palazzo Corsini, and sometimes the windows are open and the curtains are blowing. There is no climate control. But you take a work like that and you put it in the dry atmosphere of a gallery, where it's very important that temperature is controlled evenly at all times, and it can create stress in the surface of the work. So that's why they're in those cases when you go up and look at the works later. But you'll see again within these works that the narrative again it's like a photograph. It captures a moment. So here we have the nail being about to be driven into the temple of the prone figure, unaware of what is about to happen to him in Già l'Incisara. And in the Triumph of David, rather than the moment captured by, if you think of Michelangelo's remarkable sculpture of David, where the figure is captured the moment before he makes the decision to throw the stone with his slingshot, thereby bringing about the death of Goliath. Here we have the celebratory moment when David parades in victory, or the only indicator that of the deed that's been carried out, because we don't even see the head of Goliath, is the slash of blood down the edge of his massive sword, which of course hasn't brought about the death of Goliath, because the slingshot did that. It's when he severs the head. And most often he's shown triumphantly carrying the head with him. But here instead we have a celebration. We have the two figures playing musical instruments either side, and you have a symbol here, and we have a kind of triangle here. So sound, the notion of sound and celebration is introduced to the work. But also, you notice how the ground drops away, so these figures are lower. It's as if they've come up from a valley, up onto the hill, as if this procession has been taken place over time. So both of those elements are also important in the narrative. And these are, with the Triumph of David, it's a much smaller work, possibly a sketch, for a much bigger painting that's now in the collection at the Pitti Palace in Florence. Now we'll talk about the work on the right first, because this follows on from those other two paintings. And by Jacopo Legozzi, it shows the martyrdom of St. Catherine of Alexandria. And this was a favoured theme right the way through the Renaissance and the Baroque. So how does this figure as a Baroque work rather than a Renaissance painting? Now we know that Catherine of Alexandria refused to remain pagan, having adopted the Christian faith, and she spurned marriage, and so she was sentenced to be tortured on the wheel. And the wheel could be painted in all kinds of ways. Sometimes it's a single wheel with little spikes coming out of it. Sometimes it's two wheels that would have eviscerated her if she was pushed against them. But as we know with saints, they failed to be martyred at the first attempt. And the wheel sort of fell apart and exploded, and some narratives say that 50 soldiers immediately converted to Christianity. So unfortunately, decapitation was the one way that poor saints could be finally polished off. So let's look at this. If you look at the composition, you have a scene in the background and the crowd of soldiers who all are looking away as if watching her being tortured on the wheel. But in the foreground, we have the kneeling saint, her blindfolded, her head bent forward, her hands tied behind her back. And our attention is drawn to the light hitting her neck. There is no doubt where the blade is about to strike. And this figure looms above her, his arm raised dramatically. Now, if you were actually going to decapitate somebody kneeling like that, you'd be better to be standing on the other side. But let's not let that get in the way of a strong composition. So really, if he brings his head down, he's actually got to move his arm with the blade across in a very awkward manner. So it would be much better if she'd knelt it the other way. But we won't, that's not important. What is important is this gesture, but also the contrast, the tension, the muscular tension of this back leaning before the arm finally comes down. So once again, it captures that moment before the blow is struck. And that adds to the drama of it. Whereas on the left, we have this figure of Artemisia. Looking at it, if we didn't know the narrative, you would see a very pale woman. Again, a focus on flesh. Her hand clutched to her breast. The other hand holding the lid of a very elaborate urn here, and this beautiful dish or drinking vessel here, highly ornate. Now, Artemisia was of Caria. She was a Greek figure, and I love this, a description of her, and I'll just read it to you. She was a naval strategist, a commander, sister and wife and successor of Mausolus, the ruler of Caria, the Persian satrap. And I love the term satrap. It simply refers to a leader. And when her brother/husband was killed, she went into mourning, and she decided that she would drink his ashes every day. Now, in that urn are his ashes, and she's going to put some of those ashes into that drinking vessel and swallow it. Now, in the late Renaissance and the Baroque, she becomes a very different kind of symbol, because if you married and throughout the Renaissance and the Baroque, as a woman, your dowry was handed over to your husband, and he had the usufruct or use of that money. But traditionally, it was held as an inheritance for the sons that you were going to bear, provided your husband looked after it wisely. If your husband died, you had choice. You could return to your family, and they would marry you off to somebody else, which is usually what the birth family wanted to do. Or you could stay as a widow in your husband's household, and then your children could still inherit your dowry. So, of course, the husband's family always encouraged a widow to stay with them, the good widow. But, of course, her birth family, her father or her brothers, if they were still alive, might think it's much more important for you to go back home so they can negotiate another marriage with another important family. And so Artemisia became the symbol of the good widow, the one who doesn't choose to remarry, but instead lives her life devoutly remembering her husband. And there's a lovely quote here. She became to later ages a lasting example of chaste widowhood and the purest and rarest kind of love. Now that was Boccaccio, right? And so it's, the precedent is set for that kind of model for Artemisia. But let's look at a couple of other paintings of Artemisia. Francesca Farini's Artemisia again has the beautiful ewer or jug here, and you've got the vessel here. But there's something that happens here. Because her breast is semi-exposed, an erotic element is added to the work that is, and I'll go back again, I would say absent from the work that's in the exhibition. Instead, we focus on the grief in Artemisia's face. Here, though, she looks out at us. Now, the exposed breast might seem erotic to the modern viewer, but it also could be a sign of chastity, a symbol of Artemis, and Artemisia's name comes from the Greek goddess Artemis. So we have to be very careful not to read a modern reading into something that might have had quite a different perspective. But the work, I discovered this the other day, this work by Rembrandt is remarkable, because here we have a very substantial, fully clad woman pointing to herself, and a tiny servant coming towards her with this nautilus cup, which obviously contains the ashes in the wine. Here we have a woman who is literate, and you can't really see it in this image very clearly, or I can't from where I am, but there's a sort of ghostly figure watching on, a witness in the background. And it's a very different northern take on the same theme. Whereas, here we have a completely different kind of cup. Both these works in the exhibition, a very young Bacchus, the god of wine, and a Bacchante. And the Bacchantes were considered the opposite of Artemisia, because they represented women who stopped being wives and mothers and ran off to worship in the house of Bacchus and to drink and become quite wanton, and to celebrate the transformative qualities of wine, something we all know a lot about. Now, so you have on the right this very young Bacchus, and instead of vine leaves in his hair, his beautiful red hair. They look what could almost be oak leaves or perhaps some form of ivy. But he is wearing the traditional leopard skin tied over his shoulder. But it's the bacchante with her exposed breast, which bears none of the symbols that we saw in Artemisia. Here, the breast is exposed as a result of drinking. But this is a fascinating painting too. She's laughing at us. So again, it's that capturing of expression. But when you go up and look at the painting, there seems to be no whites to her eyes. They just seem like black hollows. And if you think about sculptures of the time, you, of course, unless you painted the marble, you couldn't introduce colour. And often the pupil of the eye was carved out as a little concave dip. And that, it seems to be the way she's painted as if she's also a sculpture. So you have that lovely juxtaposition between the rigidity and the coolness of sculpture and the life and warmth and pleasure of colour in the human body. And now perhaps one of the most important paintings in the exhibition by Caravaggio, this portrait of Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, we think painted around 1597. Now this is an early Baroque work, and I discovered just by chance that, this is a slight aside, that the frame that we see it in now is almost certainly not the frame that it had when it was painted of Maffeo Barberini, because it has what is called a Medici frame on it. So it's likely that it was reframed when it came into the Corsini family as part of Anna Barberini Colonna's dowry when she married Tommaso Corsini in the 19th century. The original frame would have had Barberini bees on it, which was the symbol of the Barberini family, and which is plastered all over various buildings and artworks that commissioned by the Barberini family. Now the painting on the left is a work that was destroyed in Berlin during the war, and I found it in black and white and was amazed to discover an image of it in colour. So it's, whether it was hand tinted, I don't know, whether somebody had actually managed to take, I wouldn't have thought they'd have managed to have colour photography, but you never know. I'm not a photographic expert, but it's an important work looking at our painting in the exhibition, because you can see that the treatment of the head is very, very similar. Now, this is an early Baroque work, as I said, and one of the fascinating things about it is it involves chiaroscuro, which is this contrast of chiaro is clear, light and dark within a work to add dramatic effect. But if you look at the work, the light on the face of here, on Maffeo Barberini's face, suggests a light source coming in from here, and yet the background is in darkness. Whereas we have a light background and shadow on the face. In later works, you have a very clear sense that the light source is a naturalistic light source coming from a particular window, an implied window, or some form of lighting. So what Caravaggio has done here, and he's done it to a degree in the portrait of a courtesan, sometimes called Phillida, is use the background to throw the face into strong contrast. It's almost as if it's a hard-edge painting. When you look at the outline surrounding the face, this very strong, sharp line, which you get again in this work here. But both figures look directly out at you. And whereas the courtesan or Phillida holds a small bunch of flowers to her chest, what we have in the painting upstairs is this very important still life detail. Now, Caravaggio, as I'm sure you all know, was working in Rome. He was a very charismatic and bold figure. He got into a lot of trouble with the law. He was extremely hot-blooded, but people recognized that he was quite revolutionary in his approach to art. And he was fascinated by all the northern artists who had come to Rome to see what the Roman Baroque was all about. And he picked up from them a fascination with still life painting. a subject that had really been considered inferior in Italian art until this period. So what you have in the here is a clear glass vessel, and it might be hard to pick it up in this, but you'll see it in the painting upstairs, very close to the edge of the table. It was an element that the northern painters loved, this idea that something might tumble over, and it's something that Caravaggio picks up again and again in his work. The vessel is slightly opaque, the glass, but light does pass through it. And you have a very close attention to detail in the flowers. So they're readily identified as jasmine and roses. And one of the petals, a leaf actually, has dropped into the vase and is floating in the water. If you look at the treatment of the hands, these are very good examples of foreshortening. He has a very sophisticated understanding that when you paint somebody as if you're looking at my hand like that, you have to make it look as it's moving back through space. Whereas if you look at earlier Renaissance paintings, the hands often are vertical or they're sideways, so they're easier to paint. Here you've got the hand holding the book open, that moment in time again, as if Maffeo has just looked up from his reading when the artist has entered the room. Well, of course, we know that wasn't the case. He had to pose for considerable time. But this much more complicated handling of this hand, which tightly grips the arm of the chair, as if he might just use the arm of the chair to push himself upwards. You've got this diagonal bold red slash which leads down from the lit face and the white of the collar, and this fantastic handling of this very crimped white treatment of the white fabric in the sleeve. And if we go on to other works by Caravaggio, again, you can see how he uses this still life motive. The earlier work, Boy with a Basket of Fruit, painted in 1593, has a number of the details that we've seen in Maffeo Barberini's portrait. But here, the light is used like as if a halo to throw the face into a sort of clarity. The stretching of the neck, the white of the flesh, again this wonderful white treatment of the cloth, and this sort of basket laden with a cornucopia of leaves and fruit. But again you get an allegory within the work which is picked up from northern art, because you have details like the slight blemish on this piece of fruit here and the vine leaf. The vine leaf is already starting to wither. Now within fruit, of course, you have seeds, and seeds are the beginning of life. The fresh fruit suggests the fullness of life, the withered leaves and the slight intimation of decay suggesting death. And with northern Protestant painters, that was an important way of referring to the life of Christ in particular, when you were no longer allowed to focus on representations within Protestantism. And you get it even more so, that sort of allegory in this work. This leaf is completely withered. You can see again a worm has eaten into the apple here. But he also is selling, and we know that there's seeds within all the work, but it is also a wonderful depiction of abundance. You've got figs, you've got grapes, which of course symbolize communion in Catholic works of art. But what is remarkable here, you've got the basket again on the very edge of a parapet or a table, as if we could reach out and push it in. In fact, it gives us a slight insecurity. You almost feel you want to lean over and move that basket to stop it from tumbling. But what also Caravaggio does here, which is absolutely radical at the time, is he paints a gold background. In a sense, he's playing on that notion in early Renaissance art, before we get the introduction of blue into the sky, when gold is used to symbolise the heavens. And again, the last work by Caravaggio, this boy bitten by a lizard, again slightly earlier, you've got certain elements that refer through back to the portrait of Maffeo by Farini, the still life, the flowers in the vase and a leaf floating down, as if floating down in a moment of time. But here, a lizard has leapt out of the fruit and has bitten the boy on a finger, and he's leaping backwards. So it's that demonstrating Caravaggio's ability to show the human face in a whole lot of different ways. And here, it's that sort of moment of horror, the hand thrown up, the mouth open, the frown on the boy's face as he is bitten. And that makes a lovely link across to the little work by Dandini that's also in the exhibition, which the family had thought until they started researching the exhibition, for it came to New Zealand, might have been a portrait of one of the members of the family. It probably still is, but it could also be an allegory, just as we had the allegory of hope in a few slides back. This also could be a young woman depicted as Flora. And Flora, of course, the goddess of fertility and flowers, and you see the very fine attention to detail in the sprig of flowers that she is holding. And so this could be a betrothal portrait. We know she's not married if it is a portrait, because her hair is down over her shoulders, and once she was married, she would have worn her hair tied up. And of course, if you wanted to get a husband, suggesting that you were fertile, which is the underlying symbolism of Flora, would be very important. So, as I say, it becomes very popular as for betrothal painting. She's also got very beautiful jewellery, pearls around her neck, this pendant here with a drop Baroque pearl here, and then another brooch below that. So we can tell she's from a wealthy family, which implies, and of course she has Baroque earrings in her ears. Interestingly, when Baroque pearls were discovered in South America and brought into Italy, before that they only had round pearls from oysters, and women wanted to wear them, but they were too heavy to be worn tied to the ear just with a ribbon. And in Venice, for example, Jewish women had been forced to wear a gold ring in their ear as a symbol of their faith. It was an indicator to anyone walking in the street that you were Jewish and not Catholic. And then, when Baroque pearls were introduced, Venetian women, against their husbands' wishes, had their ears pierced, because then you could sustain the weight of a Baroque pearl, and all hell let loose. But women got their way. They were going to wear those pearls come what may. So if you look at a painting with a Baroque pearl, you know the woman's had to have her ears pierced. Just a little aside. Now, another work in the exhibition, which is a brilliant example of Baroque painting, was formerly attributed to Anthony van Dyck, and a young student at Auckland University. I've had 4 students helping me with research, and he discovered this other version of the painting by Theodore Rombouts, which is in the Royal Museums of Fine Art of Belgium and Brussels. And what we think now is that this painting on the left, the one that you can see upstairs, was almost certainly done by Theodore Rombouts as well. More research has to be carried out, but you can see that the composition is identical. But I found an article about the work in Brussels, which said that when Rombouts returned from Italy, and he'd gone to Rome like many other artists to study the Italian Baroque, that his work became much paler. But there is a thought that he went to Florence and worked for Cosimo II de' Medici. So it's just possible that this work was actually painted in Florence, although we do not know how it came into the Corsini family. But what makes this a Baroque painting, par excellence, is its composition. For a start, like those other works I've shown you, they're like a photographic or a cinematic close-up. We're drawn right into the moment of drama. And of course, what's happened here is Prometheus has been sent to Mount Caucasus, chained to the mountain, and an eagle flies down every night and plucks out his liver, and then the wound heals and the eagle comes back and does it all over again. So it is focusing on that moment here when the eagle just starts to pull up the flesh. But you've also got this very strong diagonal, a very strong light falling onto the body, illuminating the paleness of the flesh, and the focus is on that screaming face of Prometheus. He's red-faced, his hands are red because he worked with his hands, and you can see the fire that he stole and gave to humans, which is why he's been published in this way, belching out of a container to the left. You get exactly the same in the painting on the right, but it has that much paler palette. This painting, the reason we discovered it was linked to an exhibition in New York. Now, I haven't included here the duvet cover that they sold in the shop at the time. I would not sleep under a duvet personally that had Prometheus plucking out my liver. But I also found online, you can go and check it out yourself, a version of the work which shows an alien plucking out. And it was very funny, but I thought I'd better be more serious as this is being broadcast, but you can check it out yourself. Now, another fascinating work in the exhibition is this work after Guercino showing the Persian Sibyl. And this is a tapestry, and it's derived from the painting which is in the Capitoline Museum of the Persian Sibyl. And we discovered, when we first started researching the works, we knew that most tapestries until the 16th century were imported from Brussels or from France into Italy. But the Medici set up their own tapestry factory in Florence, and then the Barberini, Maffao's son, grandson, no, he didn't have children, what do I say? A descendant of Maffeo Barberini set up a workshop for the Barberini, called the Barberini Workshop, to create tapestries for Palazzo Barberini and for the Pope, when Maffeo became Pope. But this we know that this tapestry is taken from a painting. And these works were commissioned by a third tapestry factory that was set up to reproduce paintings that were in the Capitoline collections. And that collection, that museum, was first established by Pope Clement XII, who of course was the Corsini Pope that followed on. And the figures of the Sibyls were a bit like the Muses, in that they came to be seen in Baroque art to prefigure events that took place, just like the Old Testament was thought to prefigure events that took place in the life of Christ. And of course the Sibyl translates or reads oracles. She predicts the future. So she becomes a very important figure that is reproduced again and again. For women looking at this painting, you can see certain links too through to Maffeo Barberini, in that it's as if she stopped for a moment she's in the process of writing. But it's interesting to note that in the tapestry, she looks at us. Whereas in the painting, it's as if she's stopped writing because she's lost in a reverie of some kind. She's thinking about the future. So again, they're beautiful examples of Baroque works. And it was Lorenzo Corsini, Pope Clement XII, who, as I said, established the Capitoline Museum. One of my favourite paintings in the exhibition has to be this one example of the French Baroque, which is the portrait by Hyacinth Rigaud of Don Neri Corsini, painted in 1710 when he was serving as an ambassador to Florence in Paris. And he writes a letter to his family saying that he's having his portrait painted by Rigaud. Now, look at this work. It's just spectacular. He has this wonderful web, and the tones of it change as it tumbles down over his shoulder to pick up on the warm tones of this remarkable cloak, which appears, in fact, just to be a great billowing cloud of fabric that wraps around him. Like Lorenzo, he looks off to one side, like Saint Sebastian as well, so that his face is caught in contemplation. And of course, you imagine having your portrait painted. It's very hard to be looked at constantly by somebody, as the artist has to do. So he looks away. But also it allows, if your face looks off at one angle, you get different shadows in the face, which sort of makes it more sculpted and easy to read. He has one hand insouciantly on his hip, the other resting on the edge of a table, and he has this, his neck, his collar, his cravat is open, so we have a sort of draping of the fabric, but it's not formal in any way. And you get this wonderful, great billowing cloud roaring up behind him, adding to the sort of dramatic moment. Well, we know, of course, it's highly structured. But as you can see in this much more formal portrait that's in Palazzo Corsini in Rome, he loses his looks when he goes to Rome. And having taken the tonsure, he also becomes much more corpulent. But he was a very important figure because, like his uncle, he helped, for a start, he carried out the Pope's commissions in Rome, very important commissions in the rebuilding of Rome. But he also developed Palazzo Corsini and built a vast art collection in the Corsini Library, which was remarkably open to people from its inception. And you can go and visit that palazzo in Rome today. In fact, you can get a double ticket. You can get a ticket to Palazzo Corsini and to Palazzo Barberini. They tend to be overlooked, but they are the most beautiful buildings and very well worth the visit. So next time you go to Rome, make sure you visit them both. One of the most important commissions that the Pope saw through to, well, he died before it was completed, but he put it in train, was the Trevi fountain. And the term Trevi comes from two words, Trevia, which means three roads, a point where three roads meet. And this is perhaps one of the most recognised and famous fountains in the world. And it was the idea for its commission first came about through Maffeo Barberini when he was Pope Urban VIII. As I said, it was Clement XII who solves the problem of how this fountain should be built. Now, Rome, as I'm sure you know, depended on the Roman aqueducts to bring pure water into the city. And some of those aqueducts had been damaged and fallen into disrepair, and a number of the popes pushed to get them restored and to have the water, because you can't have a fountain, particularly a fountain with this much water, without a very good source. So the restoration of the aqueducts were an important part of the process. And the site had been chosen, but there was a problem, because the palazzo that you see in the background, Palazzo Poli, is a private palazzo. And Clement came up with the idea of simply buying part of the space of the palazzo and knocking it through, because what he wanted was the sense of Oceanus, the god of all water, emerging from a deep space and being led by these hippocamps or horses who are dragging his chariot forward, and the work opening out so that the eye plays both in this direction and in that. And it took a lot, as I say, it took a long time to actually finish it, but it is behind the theme of it is this notion of taming the waters. So it represents something that was absolutely essential both to life but to the city of Rome. And you have the Corsini stemma above the work there. And now just finally, I'm going to look at, because Bernini, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, had a role briefly to play in the Trevi fountain as well. But I want to look at two different elements that will help you also understand how what occurred in the Baroque painting transferred equally into sculpture and to architecture. And I'll just show you these two works as a comparison. On the left we have Domenico Guidi's Dream of Joseph. And this work is set in a niche. Now, he sits on a plinth, which is a bit like cloud, but it rests on this architectural base here. So this is, if you like, anchored to what you might read as the ground. It has a light source implied by these golden rays that come down here. It's set within an architectural niche, and it is Baroque in that you have these columns here that are dynamic. They don't sit flat against a surface as they would in the Renaissance period. And you have this pediment, what amounts to a kind of almost a broken pediment, and the eye scoops back. With Baroque architecture and with sculpture, as with painting, the eye never rests. The eye is in perpetual motion. But look what happens with Bernini's remarkable sculpture of Saint Teresa in Ecstasy. She rests on a cloud, her head dropped back, her mouth open, almost as if she is receiving the stigmata, which is what, of course, happens with very early, with St. Francis, right the way through in the early Renaissance. You have an angel here who is about to pierce her heart with divine love. And you have these massive gold rays that come down, and they are gilded. But also, and I wanted to give you a close-up so I'm not showing, but there is a window above which throws natural light into the space as well. But what is particularly remarkable here, first this focus on the folding garment carved in marble. So you get these great contrasts of light and dark and flowing movement. But this cloud appears to float in midair. Now we are looking at tons of marble. That marble is anchored to the wall behind. But what is important is that we don't sense it when we first look at the work. It's only when you start to analyse it that this comes to mind. So this is a Baroque sculpture par excellence. And the same ideas feed through into two very important churches in Rome. First of all, and these are 100 yards away from each other, in Via del Quirinale in Rome, just round the corner from Palazzo Barberini. This is a church, one of my favourite churches in Rome. It's tiny, built between 1638 and 1641, and designed by Carlo Borromini. Now this work, this church, inside, doesn't use the massive range of coloured marbles that Bernini and many other architects relied on to sort of help add to the drama. Instead, it is purely the architectural form that leads your eye constantly around the work. We have an oculus above, this remarkable oval dome, its surface almost imitating the sort of coffered ceilings that you expect in a Renaissance church. And if you go up to our Mackelvie Gallery, you'll see exactly the same kind of coffering on the surface there. But it's very narrow by the altar, and it curves in and out. If you turn in a circle in this tiny church, your eye is never still. It's absolutely exquisite. And the same applies to the facade. Now this is right on the corner. There's a street going up. Via Sistina goes up here. Via Quirinale goes along here. The building undulates at the front. You've got this shield here, but there is no stemma within it. But again, the eye never rests. You're led in and out. Whereas if we go along the road 100 yards to San Andrea, designed by Bernini, you can see that it's a very different kind of design. Now, Via Coronale actually runs here. This is a very, very tiny site. So Bernini was tasked with making a church that fitted into this space. So what he did was take an oval and make it an oval that goes across the space rather than into deep space. Inside, he uses multiple kinds of marble. We've got again that oculus, that dramatic light source, these tumbling figures that surround, and rays again, that surround the painting of the Crucifixion of San Andrea. And if you look at the outside, you can see that drum, that horizontal drum that goes behind. Very narrow steps leading up to it, elements that actually, contrast with Borromini's church further along the road. So these are there is two prime examples in a very close location of the developments within Baroque architecture. And within the church itself, you have this wonderful, very highly ornate coffin here, gilded. But it's this element of playfulness that's added by these little putti, this one in particular, tumbling here and then almost swinging in this garland, which adds a kind of delightful energy to the work. And above that painting that you saw before, in the architectural line that moves around the roof, you have this broken pediment, and you see San Andrea rising up to heaven. And of course, that's exactly the effect you get if you go and look at the sketch in the exhibition painted by Luca Giordano for the glorification of San Andrea Corsini. So I'm going to stop there. That's sort of like doing the Baroque at 100 miles and a once over lightning. But I hope that just gives you a little sense of the difference between the Renaissance and Baroque works of art, and it helps you to read the works that are upstairs in the exhibition with a little bit more understanding. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?